Hello and welcome to the Choralosophy Podcast, a weekly podcast whose mission is multifaceted. Each week when you tune in, you will find episodes that question best practices, challenge music education dogma, facilitate conversations about touchy topics, demonstrate pedagogies, and conversations where colleagues learn from each other. This is episode 259, but you don't look like a conductor, with Dr. Nicole Mattfeld. Much is said about gender disparity and imbalance in the arts and education. It's a hot topic to discuss, and it's a popular one. But this week, our guest gets personal by sharing some specifics. The microaggressions of a male-dominated profession oftentimes go unnoticed and uncriticized. In this conversation, Dr. Nicole Mattfeld of Alma College discusses her experiences as a female choral conductor, highlighting the challenges of gender bias, societal expectations, and the impact of appearance on professionalism in the arts. She shares personal anecdotes about being judged based on her looks rather than her skills, and emphasizes the need for an open dialogue about microaggressions and the accountability we hold each other to in the music community. The discussion also touches on the importance of increasing female representation in leadership roles within choral music and the performing arts, and the tension between that need and the fact that in choirs, females outnumber males, oftentimes 2-1. We touch these topics and many more in a very lively, spirited conversation, so I hope you'll stick around. And then whatever your thoughts are on this topic should be brought over to us over at the Choralosophers Facebook page, where we like to discuss things that come up in shows, either recent shows or in past shows in the catalog. You can go there and weigh in on things that you hear on this show. So stick around all the way to the end and let us know what you think. Choir directors, music educators, show planners, you pour your heart into your music. Shouldn't your events get the same attention? That's where Ludus comes in. Sell tickets, promote your concerts, and fundraise with ease. Selling merchandise and concessions? Ludus Retail makes in-person sales effortless. Running choir camps or workshops? They have a classes feature that keeps registration simple, and when you need help, the live support team is ready to pop up with real answers from real people. The best part? It's completely free for organizations. Thousands of music programs already trust Ludus because great music deserves more than just a ticketing system. If you haven't already, I really think it's time for you to ditch the bulky sight-reading books, the paper, all of the things that are already in the kids' folders in your classroom because it's not customizable to what they need in the moment. Sight Reading Factory allows this and so much more, including auto-assessment for at-home assignments, no more grading them individually. They can be graded in the moment. So use the Choralosophy checkout code, Choralosophy. When you check out, it'll give you a 10% discount every time you get a membership for yourself and for all of your students, which is really, really important so they can do this at home. I'm not sure how much, if anything, out there has not gone up in price since 2020, but I know one thing that hasn't, and that is the membership to the Patreon and to the Substack to support this show. The people who are signed up over there as paid subscribers, as my thank you to them, they can get things like t-shirts from the choralosophy.com shop. They can also get access to my Google folder of teaching materials that I've talked about on the show for over the years. And of course, they just want to help make sure that this show can continue. And one of those benefits is a shout out on the show. Shout outs for the Inner Circle and producer tiers over on Patreon. We have Brian Long, Chandler Smith, Venture Studios, David Kowalczyk, Kyle Peterson, Max Jackson, Michael Herron, Rebecca Chalk, and Steve and Kathy Kakachik. All right, everybody, I'm here with Dr. Nicole Mattfeld, and Nikki is now a friend of mine. Is it okay that I say that you're a friend of mine? Is that still okay?
Yeah.
After all, not too long ago, slept for a week in this room that I'm recording as a clinician for my summer choral institute. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting about having Nikki in my house for a week is that we had some really great conversations. And one of those is the genesis for this episode, which we'll talk about a little bit more as we go. But Nikki, welcome back.
Thank you so much. I know I love the view. I recognize the view behind you. And it's great to see you again.
One of the many things that we talked about while you were here, just socializing and hanging out between rehearsals, is the idea that oftentimes as conductors and as teachers, especially in this modern era of social media, etc., we're judged in many ways by how we look. We're judged by if we appear young or if we appear old or if we're pretty or if we're not pretty, or there's all these different ways that we put appearances ahead of qualifications or performances or whatever, the meat of it, what it is that we do. And so I want to get into that soon. But first, we want to know more about you. So could you start with just who are you and what do you do every day and What's your background?
Sure. Well, I currently teach at Alma College. I'm the director of choral activities there. It's in the middle of mid-Michigan, a little small private liberal arts college in Alma, Michigan, about 45 minutes north of East Lansing, where MSU is. And there I conduct 3 choirs and teach conducting and music education courses. Before that, I lived in Minnesota for a majority of my life. That's where I'm also from. And so I have worked previously at Bethel University. I was the director of youth choirs for Minnesota Chorale. I also was the artistic director and conductor of a community choir called Minnesota Center Chorale in St. Cloud, Minnesota. I conducted a middle school girls ensemble that down in Rochester, Minnesota. And so I was sort of dabbling in a lot of different areas and, part-time jobbing it to a full-time career prior to getting my position at Alma. But before that, I taught middle school and high school choir for over a decade. I also dabbled in getting trained as a hospice therapeutic musician. So I did that part-time for a while as well, which is where a lot of my dissertation work came from, sort of that world of combining holistic healthcare and hospice music with what I do on a daily basis at the collegiate level. But basically, I've just been loving to sing and loving music my entire life, and super excited to be a guest on the show today.
That's great. Now, I'm going to go back a little bit even further. Do you remember, this is just more of your background, do you remember what moment there was when you decided you wanted to be a choir director? Like, how young were you?
Yes. Well, I started performing on stage when I was 3 years old, singing and dancing. And so music had always been a huge part of my life. But it was definitely the influence of my high school choir director that made me want to become a music educator, even though I hated sight reading every day, and I hated a lot of the things that he made us do in class. And he was definitely, you either loved him or hated him, right? He was definitely a polarizing person, but he instilled such a love for music, and really that was the driving force behind a lot of what I do today, is the emotional connection that I had with my high school choir director that really kept me going in music. And then that was built upon by the choir directors that I had in the collegiate level and beyond in my training.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. That sounds very similar to certain aspects of a couple band teachers I had. I wouldn't describe my high school choir teacher as polarizing. I feel like everybody loved him, but who knows? Maybe I just didn't talk to the kids that didn't like him. I don't know. That's possible, but definitely some polarizing music teachers in my life too. And it's interesting because that oftentimes it's those types of teachers that kick us in the pants just enough to see that there's something more than just kumbaya in a music class.
Right. And he, there were mistakes I made as a young person, and he held me accountable, and really taught me some valuable lessons outside of music. But just music was the driving force of instilling those lessons. So, we've talked about this, that I always say, I don't just teach music, I teach life, and music is the catalyst through that. And so I had that was very obvious to me from my high school director.
Right. Oh, yeah, that's great. I like to think of it as like, yes, I teach music. Music is the reason you have to sit here and deal with these life lessons in my class. If you want to get the music lessons, you're going to have to suck it up and deal with being held accountable and all those types of things because the kids, especially the high school kids that I teach, like for a lot of times, that's the first time in their life that they've been held accountable for a whole lot of stuff. Absolutely. So yeah, that's super important. All right. Yeah. So, all right, let's get to the meat of this. I'm excited about this conversation. So this seemed to be a passion topic for you. I remember one night in particular, you were sitting in my cool brown leather chair in my living room and getting quite heated about some of the experiences in your life where you feel like you have been judged either. I remember one of the first ones you brought up was just that you look young. And so people might have spoken to you diminutively or made assumptions about what you could or could not do based on that. When do you feel like in your life those types of things started happening for you? Or do you have any stories that you want to share to catch folks up on what this topic means to you?
Yeah, I think that, this will just be, before I say anything, I have been blessed to have really, really positive, overarching, positive memories of all the positions I've held. So this isn't just, none of these problems or these moments have tainted any of the joys that my positions and jobs have brought. It's just a theme and a thread that I've seen throughout every single job I've held, whether at the secondary level, collegiate level, community level, and it really has been prevalent my entire career. And so before I start talking about some of these things that have been challenging, I just wanted
Yeah,
to
that's a
say,
good caveat. That's a good
yeah,
caveat. And so maybe you could say it like, tell me if this is a wrong way to phrase it. Like, it doesn't define your career, but it's just enough of a stick in your craw that you think it's an important conversation to get out there.
yes. And I'm hoping that by me sharing this, it will just open up the conversation, because I know that I'm not the only person that has felt this way.
Right.
But I can tell you that the most jarring moment for me was actually at my first choir concert ever. I was a 22-year-old teacher. I just graduated. And of course, I was already nervous because it's your first concert. And so we were doing quite challenging repertoire. And so I was very nervous about conducting. And I remember after that first concert, a parent and his son came up to me. His son was in choir and came up to me and said, "Wow, that concert was so great, but I have a new nickname for you. And it's Miss Rump Shaker,
Oh,
because
no.
of how I was moving my body during a very, boisterous song. I think there were drums involved. I don't even remember what song it was, but something like Shoshalosa, right? Where it's this like vibrant spirit. And I was obviously moving in a way that matched the song. But what was so shocking to me was that at 22 years old, I was just told that. And it really was defeating, because I was so proud of myself for the level of musicality my students had, and the musical accomplishments. And then one of the first moments of feedback had nothing to do with the music, and it had to do with somebody watching what I was doing on the podium, and really was quite sexist comment, because I'm sure that person would not have said that to a man. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's almost like he said, or the subtext there is, hey, great concert, but you know what I really noticed was your body.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the subtext of that. Is that?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And the same thing goes for, it's been rare now not so much, but in the first 10 years of my teaching, for sure, there was never a concert where I didn't hear, "Oh, you looked like one of the students." And those types of things, which again, for one person saying it may seem insignificant, but when you're hearing it 5 to 6 to 7 times every single concert, it sort of does feel like it's a way to demean somebody or make me feel like less than. And I know they mean it in a kind way, but there have been men that have experienced this as well. I had a colleague who had kind of a baby face, and he felt the same way. He was in his 30s, and people would say, "Oh, you look so young." Or I remember the first time I ever conducted at Bethel University, that was also one of the first things that somebody said was, "Oh, I thought you were like a graduate student or a student." And at that point I had taught for over 10 years and had my master's. And I just think that we're a little bit flippant with comments like that. And again, I think everyone means well, but they have to really choose their words carefully, because they don't know that this is perhaps the 4th or 5th time that person has heard that all night.
But it seems like in the arts, partly because our professions are so visually public, like we do have to get dressed up pretty and get on stage in a fancy outfit, and that's kind of part of the deal. And so there, in some ways, we are placing some attention on the way we present ourselves and our appearance, etc. And so I think it's possible that people feel like it's okay because we're a visual, like there is a certain aspect of what we do that is a visual art, and as a result of that, there are a lot of even folks within our profession. You mentioned the story about a dad coming up from the audience, but even colleagues, that it's, for my whole life, I feel like it's been very normal for to hear people comment to each other about their appearance and what they're wearing. And of course, there's a famous example of a choir podcaster that preceded me doing an episode about whether or not women should wear leggings as pants when there was a big brouhaha online about that years ago. So I feel like this is something that we deal with a lot. Do you think there's anything to that? And do you think there's a connection between maybe that and why sometimes we have a lot of even sexual harassment things with colleagues? And, this goes on, like this kind of stuff happens a lot. And I can't imagine it happens this much for accountants, but I might be wrong.
Right. I do think there is a part, where obviously if you're wearing a beautiful dress, someone might comment on that dress. Or if you
Yeah.
have, a great outfit on. I think what was so shocking to me, Chris, was that when we were talking about this, I asked you and the other Chris Maunu, about, how many times you have been at, or someone had mentioned something about your appearance at a concert, and you just were like, maybe a couple of times, like both you and said, yeah, maybe a few times. And I know
Yeah.
Chris Maunu commented that some people had asked him about his Mandarin collar shirt at times, and they were just interested in why it looked different and the style of it. And that was so different from my point of view, because as a female, I have never had a concert where someone has not said something about my appearance. And they're always compliments and it's always really lovely. But I think that as my career has progressed, I'm wanting instead for those comments to be about the professional part of my job. Yes, looking nice is part of your profession, and looking appropriate and dressing appropriately to match the concert setting. But I am there to do a job, and my job is conducting. My job is putting on the best performance, putting on a moving performance. And it's really not meant to be about us as conductors either. It's definitely about the students and about the music. And so I think that there are ways to complement someone looking nice, but still keeping it at a professional level. And I do think that there is a difference between what women are told and what men are told. I
Yes.
think that women are told a lot more, oh, you look so beautiful. And I don't think most people go up to a man and say, wow, you look really handsome in your tux, Chris. I think that's less common.
Hmm.
And for some reason, I think that people focus more on the appearance of females more than they do the appearance of males. And I don't think it's necessarily anybody's fault. I think a lot of it is societal bias. And for sort of these underlying really subtle sexism that is still prevalent, even though we're almost in 2026. I think we're making better strides, but I think there's still a long way to go, not just in the inclusivity of women in leadership roles, but in the way that they're treated. And I think that I've seen my male counterparts be treated differently than myself. And so I think that's more of what I'm getting at is, would you say the same comment to a male in my
Right.
position?
Yeah. We all love to travel with our students, but we definitely don't love planning a trip. I know I've been there as the point person for details, and it is a nightmare. Forms, payments, fundraising, it's a never ending task that takes away from doing what we love. That's where Kaleidoscope Adventures comes in. They've been planning performance trips for more than 30 years and handle all the details from start to finish. And one of the best parts about Kaleidoscope, they have crowdfunding options for every traveler. Contact Kaleidoscope Adventures at mykatrip.com to find out how they can take your travel beyond expectations. No, that's totally fair. And I think the thing that comes to my mind hearing you lay that out is also just like, well, especially when you said that as you progress in your career, you kind of long for that feedback that has nothing to do with how good you look in a dress. Whereas, and I think because, of course, you're doing collegiate work now, there's a certain expectation of scholarship, and there's, in addition to having choirs that sound good, and there's so much more to your job that has nothing to do with the showmanship or
Right.
showwomanship on stage. And it made me think about conversations that I've had over the years with my wife Beth, who is conventionally beautiful and has been noticed for that her whole life, and would sometimes just love to be noticed for how good of a soprano she is, or how good of a voice teacher she is, or whatever, because that's what people notice first. And then on the flip side of that, as relatively average looking male, I sometimes would like to be told that I look nice in my tux, to be honest.
Yeah.
So I think there's some aspect of it that is like a perspective thing. Like I know, for example, and I'm sharing this just because I think it's related in some ways. I sometimes have to remind myself that when Beth looks fantastic, that might not be the thing she wants to hear right now.
Yeah.
She might not want to hear me say that. Sometimes she wants to hear that. So I think there's a balance to it, but in professional settings, I think the rules kind of have to change. It's not almost like we should default to the professional comments. Does that seem like?
Yeah, I think so, because I mean, regardless of, what you're choosing to wear, or how you look. It's not about you as a person, and like it almost feels like you're being focused on instead of the music or the singers, and whether it's positive or negative, I just think that when we're in a concert setting, when we're doing our professional job, that the comments that are said to other people should really remain professional. And there's a way to say, wow, your conducting was so elegant. You're so spirited I would love to sing for you. There's ways where you can compliment a person in the way that they move their body, for example, without saying rump shaker or something, right? You could say, wow, you are so spirited. You have such a great presence when you conduct, right? And I think if the compliment was sort of said in that context, and again, I'm getting into semantics here, but I think the overarching theme is that there has been a lot more focus on the female appearance at the choral level than the male appearance. And actually, there was an article in the 2023, I think it was May, Choral Journal, where they were talking about the gender disparity at the collegiate level, where in 2020 there was still only 25% of the collegiate educators in leadership positions were women. So we were at about 25% in 2020. But what was more surprising to me in the article was they interviewed 11 different director of choral activities across the country. Several of these women I've had the pleasure to work with. I know them as people. And the comments that were made were very similar to mine. There was even a quote that somebody had said, somebody had told them that they like the way they wiggle their butt when they conduct. Or I like the way your pantsuit, I wrote it down, your pantsuit accentuates your assets. And there was even, I know, and there was even comments made where somebody told them, well, you're really beautiful, so maybe that will help us recruit more men into the music department. Which things like this I have heard as well. And this is crazy to me because these are 11 of the top choral conductors in the country, people that are at the heights of their career. And they had said, through various comments in this article, that they felt like they were treated very differently as their male counterparts. And I think we're talking about something even beyond hiring, right? We know that there's a gender disparity between women and men in choral education, especially at the collegiate level, but in all of classical music. There's been tons of articles that have come out about that. But I think what is more alarming is even if women are hired into these positions, I think it's the way that they're treated that really is becoming a problem, and not just when they're on stage either. It seemed like through that article that a lot of their thoughts and the quotes aligned with mine, of feeling that, they're spoken to a little bit differently being a female. And again, I think that some of it is maybe just a way to sort of subtly like disempower with words and sort of coddling, like, oh, you're so cute, and that kind of language. Where it seems like women are still feeling like they're less than, even if they're in these leadership positions. So I think my experience sort of points to a larger problem that I think we could easily do something about.
Right. Now, of course, I don't need you to out anybody by name or anything, but you had mentioned that you talk to people about this. Like, this is a thing that comes up at conventions and people gossip about it, etc.
Yeah.
Do you get the sense that this is almost a category of microaggressions is kind of what it sounds like we're talking about? There's that concept of a microaggression, meaning that the person doesn't say an outward insult per se, but then there's always that nagging thing in the back of your mind that says, well, why'd you say that to me at all?
Yeah.
Why did that even need to be said? Kind of like the idea of, well, you're pretty, so you're going to help us recruit more boys. In reality, that might be true, actually, but it doesn't need to be said. Like, it could result in that. It could result in that. That isn't a qualification for being hired, and therefore it becomes an unprofessional comment simply because it isn't part of why I'm here. That's not why I'm here. Does that make sense?
Right, absolutely. And I've had the experience of a board member that was on a hiring committee had said that there was similar conversation about me being hired for a position, that I would be really good at fundraising events, right? Comments like that. And I think what that does to a person who is trying to be a professional, is it just lowers their confidence, because they want to know that they were hired for their skill, for their talents, for their dedication, right? For their integrity. And then when you keep hearing comments like that, you go, oh, well, was I hired because I was the best person for the job? Should I even be here? It sort of makes you doubt your own sense of self. And it also demeans all the hard work that you've put in. I mean, we work really hard to be good at our jobs, and to be all that we're asked to be, because, we're asked to be much more than we don't just stand up there and wave our arms, right? There's a lot
Right.
that goes into our job. And so, in a way, it can really demean somebody. And yes, I've had many conversations with other women in the field of all ages, that have experienced similar things. Even something, I was talking with a friend, we were judging a state contest, and I was talking with her about how she said, I wore a blazer today and I felt a different level of respect than when I didn't wear a blazer yesterday. And I've heard that from females, that if they wear a blazer, which is a more male type of outfit, that sort of
Mm-hmm.
heights your figure a little bit more, they get a different level of respect than if they were to wear a dress. And so again, I think these are all, like you said, kind of microaggressions. They're not intentional. Just like we all have to sort of watch ourselves with what we say. But I think that it's something that isn't talked about as much. And I think we like to kind of pat ourselves on the back, like, oh yeah, look at all these women entering choral music, or these female conductors. We're really not there yet. And I feel like part of this behavior and some of these comments that are still happening, in almost 2026, I think
Mm-hmm.
that there's a real issue there. And that might be hindering some women from wanting to pursue more leadership roles, or feeling like they can even.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's interesting because I'm trying to think of, as you're telling all these stories, I'm just trying to reflect on my career of 20 plus years now of being around quite a few. I've been fortunate to be around quite a few female conductors, although I don't know that I've had a significant amount of experience singing for one.
Hmm.
I've worked alongside them, but my directors in college were men. I had a female choral director in high school, but along with a male director in high school. But ever since then, for the most part, I've sung for men. And I also am curious to think about, like, how would I have been perceived by those female colleagues related to this topic? Because I think about, like, I think I'm treating everyone with respect, but unless someone told me, I wouldn't know.
Right.
And so because in a lot of those types of situations, you've mentioned it a few times already, like, I think the person might be trying to be complimentary, but dot, 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 they don't realize how it makes them, people feel. And I think that for me, that's the value of having this episode, doing this conversation, is because it can cause somebody to think about, yes, it could be intended as a compliment, or it could just be intended as an innocent comment that had no malice behind it at all. But if by putting yourself in the other person's shoes, you might see it differently. Thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think part of it is we live in a society where we are on social media and we're part of people's lives. And I think that has to do a little bit with it, of that, sometimes we forget that we're not behind a keyboard.
Right.
And being able to we sort of feel like we have all access to everyone's parts of everyone's lives, where
Mm-hmm.
because we live in this world where we share everything. I've seen it a lot in, like, with celebrities, where, people will say things about people losing weight, gaining weight, and make these horrible comments, from behind a keyboard. And I don't know if that's maybe part of it, is the influence of social media, because our jobs are public, because we have to get up on stage and showcase what we're doing. Maybe people feel like they can comment more freely on people's appearances. But again, I think that it's much more common for people to comment about a female's appearance versus a male's appearance. And so all I'm just saying is, maybe we just make it professional for everybody, no matter what gender. And, if I'm not going to act like I'm in a super marginalized community, right? I'm a white heterosexual female. So if I'm feeling this way, I can't imagine if I was somebody who maybe was homosexual or transgender, who is still having to get up there and perform, in front of a crowd and feel judged for what they're wearing or what how they're choosing to wear their hair, or somebody from a different race. I think that I'm not going to act like my struggles have been any comparable to that. But I do think that, we sometimes forget that females are still a minority, especially in classical music, especially in leadership roles. And so I just think that keeping it to the professionalism and the skills that we're there to do, and focusing on the music and the performance. And again, unless you really know somebody well and you're friends with them, but you never really know what people are dealing with. You never know. Maybe somebody looks great because they lost some weight, but maybe they're sick. Maybe they're struggling with an eating disorder. I went into intensive outpatient therapy when I was 30 for my eating disorder that I had a majority of my life. And I'm very open about it, but part of my struggle was, I think, this feeling of being judged constantly with what I do for, a daily living. And it wasn't helpful when people would comment on the size of me, and there are things, we can't change about ourselves. Do I wish I was 5'9" instead of 5'2"? And, my voice was a little lower so I could sound more intimidating, with my classes and things like that. There are all these things that we can't change about ourselves, yet we still have to do our job, right? And so I think that my point is that you should be able to wear a beautiful dress if you want. You should be able to wear a pantsuit if you want. You should be able to wear a blazer if you want. And regardless, as long as it's appropriate, and doesn't take anything away from the choir, I think that you should be respected the same as anybody else, male, female. If you're in a tuxedo or a dress, it shouldn't matter what you're wearing or what you look like. You should be judged on the product, right? And the love that you're instilling for music in your students, and the quality of the performance. And that should be what is the focus of your comments, instead of, how good your hair looks on stage.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I wonder too, kind of, if we were to take this and kind of go to the next level of depth, which would be that this environment, as we've discussed so far, where the microaggression type comment can become just so acceptable and so normal for people in your position. And as you pointed out, I haven't experienced a whole lot of them. I've had a few in my lifetime, and they stick out to me as weird, but they don't stick out to me as like the water I swim in or anything. It's, so it's an experience, but not something I'm familiar with or very familiar with. But if we have professional environments where these types of comments and these types of expressions are so normal, then it could, and I would argue does, lead to more serious things. Like if it's normal for me, let's say we're colleagues, and it's normal for me to make comments, little comments here and there about your appearance every day when I come into the office, then it's not that much of a nudge to get to that next step of something that's a little bit more harassing, a little bit more sexual, even a little bit more professionally inappropriate, hostile work environment, sexual harassment, even to the next, and that we, of course, hear a lot. There's lots of famous stories about conductors who, male conductors who have been, called out publicly, some of that have lost their jobs. But of course, there's also some that just never get held accountable ever. And it just continues to happen. Is this something do you see a connection between this, or am I just being one of those conspiracy theorists online?
No, I do think that there's a connection, because I think anytime that women in so many ways are often seen as like items, right? That's maybe not the right word, but some like kind of
Commodities.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Yes. And beauty.
Something to show off.
Yes, exactly. And beauty and youth, and we're fed all of these things. Any commercial online is about how you can be younger or thinner or more attractive, basically, right? The beauty industry is a multi-billion-dollar company, and especially for women. And so I think there's this idea that, youth and beauty is like the best thing you can be, right? So I think that not only living in that society, but then when you're right, like if our colleagues are used to commenting, or people in general, right, are used to commenting on our looks and that's become a normal thing, and that becomes an everyday thing, it makes it a lot easier to have an inappropriate touch here and there. And I've never experienced any of that in any of my work environments, thankfully. But, I've experienced people being weird after concerts and like hugging and touching. And, I think that in my professional world, there's been moments where I've sort of been like, ooh, kind of weirded out. There's been inappropriate behavior. I think that for women, if you're a friendly person too, that can be misconstrued as being flirtatious when really you're just being a nice person. Which I think that was one of the things that was actually said in that Discounting Our Colleagues article, was that women have to toe this fine line of being kind, but not too kind. That could be taken as flirtatious, but not being too mean, because then they'll be known as a bitch, right? Or somebody who is, you don't want to be around. So it's like we have this little wiggle room. And I think all of it sort of ties together to, again, this narrative that we've been taught from before I was born, that, women have a certain place, and we're sort of still fighting against some of those microaggressions, some of those things that societal bias, basically, right? And we can say all we want that, we're fighting and we're making a difference, but then we still see, even with the Me Too movement, how many of those women are not believed. We don't believe women. We don't take them for their word, still in 2025. And again, there are so many instances where men are actually at the head of a lot of these sexual inappropriate behavior, that still are able to keep their jobs, or they just move to a different state or move to a different, group, whatever it may be, and they're not held accountable for that. So I think that it's a mixture of all those things. I think it's just society in general, and we just have to be really aware that we're not that we're not taking steps backward when we have worked really hard to get ahead in a lot of ways.
Yeah, no, that's well said. And I've had people over the years reach out to me since I just started doing this show, asking why, what, I know that such and such of a guy did this, and this. Why don't you out them on your show? Like, well, because I don't have any evidence that what you just said is true, right? So there's a certain amount of we hear about these things, and we there's a due diligence that we should do before we try to hold someone accountable. Just because a person said it doesn't mean it's true. Like there is that aspect of it, but at the same time, we hear all these stories, like you just mentioned, of a director that maybe has been accused of this type of behavior many, many times, but that still is in the same job. Or I would even say, in some ways, it's kind of worse, where the director just leaves that job and goes to another job where there's no mechanism for accountability there at all either. And so I just don't know if this is something you've ever thought about, but I know I think about, what do we do about that? Like, there's got to be some middle ground. For example, in this modern era of kind of calling out people online for random stuff, it's frustrating for me to see directors that everybody seems to know is a total scumbag, but they have successful careers. But at the same time, we're nitpicking each other for all kinds of stuff. But why aren't we holding each other accountable for these important things, like being a harasser? Is it do you notice this contradiction?
I do. And I think that we wait until, I was in Minnesota. We had an issue where I was actually on the Minnesota Music Educators Board. And we had one of our board members who was actually brought to court and was arrested for inappropriate misconduct. And I had actually experienced some sexual harassment from this person while I was on the board. Like, we were board members, and, I thought it was a completely professional relationship, and it ended up becoming very inappropriate. And I didn't even say anything at the time, which the executive director, after everything had happened with this person, she said, "I really wish you would have told me." And I thought about it a lot, and I go, that's just kind of become a norm. I was part of the problem by not telling the executive director, because I thought it would hurt my career. I was on this board, and I, was a VP, and I didn't want to cause waves, right? Well, it ended up that this person had allegations in a separate state, and he's now serving time, for inappropriate misconduct. Now, this is with underage students, so it's a little bit different, but again, I felt even in that moment that I couldn't say anything, because a lot of times throughout my life, I have tried to say something and it was like, oh, well, you're probably exaggerating. Or, again, it's that sort of non-belief of women in general. And so I think that there's a lot of issues in that. And I don't really know how to fix that, because that's a societal problem. I think as the choral educators, we have a right to, not just a right, but a due diligence to protect one another. And so I think one of the biggest things we could do is just start talking about it more. And I think even just something as simple as this, of like talking about these issues and these comments that women are facing, and maybe that allows someone to say, oh, wow, I never really realized that really isn't appropriate, and I don't have to put up with that. And I think that's part of it, is that, as not just as women, men probably deal with this too, but we put up with some things that maybe aren't appropriate, or we know aren't professional, we know aren't okay, but we just put up with it anyway. And so I would love to see the choral education field, and maybe even some of the groups that lead the charge in choral music or music education, maybe put out an article about this, put out ways in which, institutions and nonprofits can help fight against this happening, to show support for people that do feel harassment, that do feel like there is sexism happening in the workplace. Because I think that probably part of it is just people are scared to lose their jobs, or feel like they're not going to get the amount of respect or even be believed. And that's why they're not coming forward.
Right. No, absolutely. I think you're right. There was an episode I did not too long ago with Megan Farrison, who is a colleague who wrote a memoir, about this an experience as a student with a male director being inappropriate and starting a relationship, et cetera. And so, of course, I was willing to do that type of a public, episode, because there was evidence this person had been arrested. Like, it wasn't just hearsay. It wasn't just like, somebody DMing me on Facebook with gossip, that kind of thing. And so for anyone listening, if there are more of those stories that need to be outed to people, like, I'm willing to do it. There just has to be, I think we have to follow certain protocol of like what justifies this type of thing. However, I think I agree with what you said, which is that because it's such a norm of not speaking out about it, in some ways there almost has to be like I don't know, you're a Midwesterner too, but originally, right? Like, I guess South Dakota, the Dakotas and Minnesota, and so that counts, of this phenomenon where we are so polite. It's almost like when two Midwesterners arrive at the door at the same time, it's just, and I'll go, no, you go.
Yeah.
And I think there is some of that going on with like, well, I would speak out about my thing, but I don't want to be the only one speaking out about my thing. And so if other people speak out, then I'll speak out too. And so I think that's what worries me, is that I think it's hard for a lot of women, especially because of the I'm worried about my career thing. Now, I'm interested in your thoughts though, too, about like when you said I would be worried about how it might impact my career. What does that mean? Like, what is the fear there, do you think?
I mean, so much of, I think, being a female in the choral world, especially at the collegiate level, is you're already sort of up against a male dominated world, right? And I think that, so you look at being a female as like, I already have to prove more just because I am a female, right? And I'm sure if you are a Black conductor or somebody who is maybe transgender, I imagine that is amplified even more. But I feel like I have to do more. I have to work harder. I have to be more on time. I have to do all of these things just to get to the same level as maybe some of my male counterparts. Now, maybe that's not true, but I know that exact thing was said in that article as well that I quoted earlier, from those 11 DCAs who are females. The other thing that I thought was interesting is all of the quotes in that article were anonymous. So you knew that they were coming from those 11 women, but each quote it wasn't said who said what. Now, I think that's very interesting, because I do think that there is this fear of knowing who said what, and then people talking. And And then maybe you would lose an honor choir gig. Maybe you would lose, heaven forbid, your actual like main job, but it's possible. I mean, this is the reason why women don't speak out, in the Me Too movement. They're not, the fear of not being believed, because oftentimes when it's a man against a woman, the man is believed, especially if it's somebody who has been somewhere longer than you, or perhaps is somebody above you in rank, right? It's very scary to put yourself out there. And I do think that, I feel like anything that's super controversial as a woman, I try to steer away from, because I am worried about people saying, well, she's a woman. It's that, like, they, back in the day, they blamed everything that a woman did on hormones. I mean, there
Yeah.
is still a little bit of that left in society, which is kind of crazy to think about, but I'm not the only one who feels this way. Many of my friends who I've talked to feel this way, that they automatically have to prove themselves more because they're a woman if they're entering a room. And so I think that if you're going to accuse a man of doing something or being inappropriate, they'll come back and say, oh, well, you were probably flirting with them. Oh, well, what were you wearing? Right? Were you doing something that was inappropriate? Were you wearing a really low cut shirt because, maybe you were kind of asking for it? I mean, I've heard things like this. Not said. It's very accusatory for the woman. And so it does make you worry about how you would be viewed by society and by the people around you.
Yeah, that's for sure. I know that, there is an adult like norm just for males, females, everybody in the workplace that is important, which is that if employee A is making employee B uncomfortable, and I'm just thinking about like the stupid training videos they make us do in our back to school stuff, and like they're important topics, but at the same time you got to watch the video and then click the quiz, and so your administrator will stop bothering you. Like we all have to do those types of things. But if employee A is making employee B uncomfortable in whatever way, there is that responsibility for all parties to communicate what it is that their boundaries are so that everybody knows what's going on. And then if you choose to continue that behavior, then you get into what would legally be considered harassment or, whatever. So for example, if the male employee is making a lot of comments about the outfits of the female employee, it really could be that he thinks he's being nice. Mm-hmm. It really could be. But then the female employee says, you know what, could we just not make the comments about my outfit? And then he just keeps doing it anyway. Then you actually have like, okay, so that can be called harassment or hostile work environment. And so I guess the reason I'm bringing this up is because it's there. I've seen online, I think this is where this is coming from, is I've seen online colleagues go out onto Facebook and blast other colleagues for these types of things. And I sometimes wonder, has there ever been a conversation? Like, have we ever had a conversation between these two people before I went to the blasting stage of that this is making me uncomfortable, et cetera. Can you please stop? But even that is hard. Like that, and so I just don't know really the answer, and I know we're not here to solve the world's problems, but I wonder if you've ever thought about that tension or noticed it.
Yeah, I think that, well, being from the Midwest, we don't talk about anything.
Yeah.
We're so passive aggressive. I mean, I've learned a little bit because I did have colleagues that were from the East Coast, and so at Bethel University, and they were very forward, but it was normal, right? But to me, it felt like, oh my gosh, we're very, they would talk about things and and have intense conversations, and I was not used to that. So I think part of it.
This must be why Midwesterners think I'm weird. That must be why it is.
It was quite. Yeah, it was quite a shock. I remember in our first department meeting, they didn't get heated, but they were having intense conversation, and they just said what they thought, and I was like, wow, this is different, because if my family, we joke about how we talk to everybody else in my family except the person who you actually have a problem with, and so I think part of it is that, and the avoidance of, that awkward feeling and not knowing how the other person is going to take it too. Right. Or I think I have a problem with setting boundaries because I don't want to come across like I'm being, the B word, which is what women are called all the time. So I know in the past, like I've always like hugged people And like, I've started to sort of put up boundaries of like, no, you know what, when I'm in a professional setting, I'm going to shake their hand instead of being hugged. Like, that was one of the things I decided to do, because sometimes that was misconstrued as me flirting with them, which was crazy to me when, we're friends and we happen to be like working together. So I've tried to stick to that. So that's one thing that for me personally has felt a little bit more like professional versus personal, right? Just having that boundary. But I think part of it is you're worried you're going to offend your colleague, or you're worried you're going to offend somebody on a professional level, and that's going to affect your job or affect the way that you're treated for the rest of your time at that job, right? I've
Yeah.
never really been in that position of like with somebody that I've worked with every day. But, going back to my situation with my board member, I was married at the time, so I was worried about how would my husband feel if he found out that this person was talking inappropriately, and we had had meetings together. It was just like a really awkward situation. He was also married. So it was just an awkward thing that in that regard. But then you add on top of it, oh yeah, we're also professionals in the same state. We were planning this festival together. I mean, we were doing all these things professionally that I didn't want to ruin, I guess. Something that I was excited about on a professional level. And then you start doubting yourself, like, oh, maybe I was reading too much into it. Or, I mean, it was pretty obvious you couldn't really read into it. But, I was worried if I would lose my position on the board, or if I would force them to be kicked off the board, if people would get mad at me about it. I only felt comfortable speaking about the harassment after he was taken to court on this suit. So, I mean, it took that for me to finally speak my truth about what had happened, which
Yeah.
is pretty drastic, I would say. And I'm a pretty open person. So for somebody who is even more shy or more private, I can't imagine them ever saying anything, because it's very, very vulnerable to put yourself in that position. And I think that's probably part of the reason why people don't want to have those initial conversations, which I agree, Chris, could like get rid of this problem probably a lot easier if we just have open communication. But I think, it's a weird time in life where I think we're worried about, jobs are fewer and far between, especially at the collegiate level. I think that we're trying to protect the sanctity of our job. And I know that if something were happening to me, I would think twice about it, because I would say, well, I can put up with this, but what I can't do is lose my job, but I can deal with this. It's not the
Right.
best thing, but I can deal with it. Should we have to deal with it? No. But I think that's unfortunately just the world that we live in. And it happens a lot more in the instrumental professional musician world. There's been lots of articles about in the orchestral world about this happening a
Sure.
lot.
Famous ones.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I wonder too if sometimes we rationalize it, or women in that situation could rationalize it based on like a pick your battles kind of a mindset. Like, yeah, this is annoying but like you said, I can deal with this, but do I really want to have this fight? Is that going to make it overall worse? And so I think that, which, there are lots of rational people who would make those types of decisions and deal with it anyway. But at the same time, I agree. I think the open communication part is really important. I just know that I cringe when these things get to be public finally, because in a lot of ways it makes the rest of us look bad too. So like whenever I hear like a story of another high school choir director who's just been arrested for some kind of thing with students, or a conductor, even of an orchestral conductor who is been let go from their orchestra because of complaints of sexual harassment. There is also there's I guess a meme online, the air quotes, not all men, and then they'll make fun of you for saying that, not all men do this, which in reality is true. The vast majority of men don't do this. But at the same time, I believe personally that men do have a responsibility to speak out against that type of behavior, not to prove that we're one of the safe ones, but because we are also in positions of authority. Like in my classroom, I'm in a position of authority. In a choir that I conduct, I have a position of authority. And so it kind of takes everybody speaking out about these things that has institutional power to make any kind of real change. Thoughts about that?
Yeah, I agree. And I think that regardless of what age you teach, even though I teach students that are adults, it is my job to protect them. And
Mm-hmm.
I am in a position of power. I'm in a position where I'm very influential to them. And so I think that regardless, there's been collegiate teachers that have lost jobs or been accused of, having inappropriate relations with their students. And I've actually had people tell me, well, they were adults. And I said, but that doesn't matter. You are in a position of power. And regardless of what age, anything, if you are taking that power and using it in a sexual way with your students, I think that needs to be talked about. And I think that we're scared, a lot of times these conductors have very high ranking jobs or are well known in the communities. And I think that we're scared to say, you know what, this isn't okay. And part of it, I think, is the institutions that support some of these conferences. I think if they took a better stance of saying, hey, we don't condone this type of behavior, and just putting a statement out. And maybe those people shouldn't be allowed at those conferences anymore. Maybe they shouldn't be allowed to be, continuing in these other jobs. I mean, it is part of our job to, I don't want to say blacklist, but I mean, when you have been accused or convicted of certain things over and over and over again, I think that it is our job as music educators to ensure that we protect the rest of the community, the rest of the students. I mean, we're all mandated reporters, right? So what are we doing if we are letting these people who have been accused of things, and a lot of times there's been pretty significant evidence, even though it has gone to court maybe, right? We're no better than the Catholic Church in some ways, where they're moving priests around knowing what's going on. I mean, if we really think that this is going on and we're continuing to hire these educators for all of these events throughout the United States, working with youth, and this is not just in the choral world, but in the orchestra world, in the band world, I think that we're doing a huge disservice to these students. And I like Megan's situation, having been sexually harassed, and writing a book about it later, like how many people are out there who haven't shared their story? How many people are out there? Yeah. And I think that that's our number one responsibility. We want to keep our students safe, and we're not talking about this. And it's scary. And I think that we need people at the higher levels of some of these institutions to maybe speak out about it and say, hey, this isn't okay. We don't condone this behavior. But then actually follow through, perhaps by, saying, hey, you're not allowed to do this event. And actually, I was really quite proud of Minnesota. They had a guest conductor when I was on the board for an all-state, and they ended up asking that person to not do it because of allegations that were made. And I was quite proud of Minnesota because that was controversial, I'm sure, but they were protecting those students in that program. Yeah. And so I really applauded them and the board. I was proud to be a part of the board for that decision.
That's great. All right, I've got one more thing for you to react to before we wrap this up. Is kind of my hot take. I've said this on the show before, but it's been a few years. My hot take about, in general, if we want to have less entitled, toxic male choral directors, we actually have to make sure we have more male choral singers. And because, of course, one of the things we've talked about is that women are in the minority in leadership positions in conducting, but of course, women are in the majority in choirs by a lot. We get more female students. And my view on this is that I think one of the reasons, I'm not laying all the blame at this, but one of the things that contributes to this is that boys in choir from a young age get taught that their shit does not stink, because they are needed so badly by their choir directors that I think it starts to bring into their mindset from a very young age that, like, I am the specialist one here because look how badly they needed tenors and I am a tenor. And I think that's not unrelated to then growing up to believe that, like, the whole choir is there for it's your playground, whereas women have, like, they have to grow up fighting for that spot in the choir. They fight to make their top choir at the high school. They fight against each other to make that choir in college, whereas the men can sometimes show up and fart out of their mouth and still make it because they fart an octave lower. Thoughts about that?
No, I completely agree. And actually, this was a conversation I had with many of my students when I started at Alma College, because there used to be two mixed ensembles. And then, as the tenors and basses started to be less and less, it became a women's ensemble, an SSA ensemble. And so the guys just automatically got to be an Alma choir, which is the touring choir, which is the quote top choir, even though both are incredible and they're both auditioned. But actually, I made a change when I got there, as freshmen sopranos and altos could audition to be in the top group, which before they weren't even able to audition. So I think that that's, again, that like kind of double standard of like, oh, well, you're a boy, you're automatically in the top choir because it's the only choice. But it does give sort of this elevated idea to the tenors and basses. And actually, sometimes I catch myself not complimenting the sopranos and altos on the job they're doing, but complimenting more the tenors and basses, even though I'm hard on the whole choir, right? But I think it's because I want them to stay. Like I have 6-7 tenors in my choir, right? And so if I lose a couple of them, that's a big deal. Whereas if I lost a couple of altos, right, when there's 16, 17, it's less of a big deal. And that's not fair to those students who have worked just as hard. And so I do think that there is an element of, well, I'm needed here, right? That maybe does play into that ego a little bit of the men that you're speaking about. I think that a lot of it is just when you think about, one of the comments I've had after performances has been, well, you don't look like a conductor. And I said, well, what do conductors look like? And, most people, I believe, are envisioning a white man. I mean, that's what we've seen. That's what we see on social media, for years and years. That's still the majority. And so I think that part of that sort of the male dominated world is just that's a man's place. It's a position of power. I don't think about it like this, but you really do have everyone at your fingertips when you're a conductor, and you might have 100 or 200 musicians on stage and they'll all breathe with the movement of your hand. I mean, that is a position of power, and it's no different than like a CEO at a big company. I mean, this is not just a musical issue, right? This is women in general are not seen as in positions of power as commonly as men. And so I do think that there's just that drives the ego. I do think that, however, what's really interesting to me is that there are more non-collegiate female choir directors, but there's less at the collegiate level. So again, and I'm not saying that collegiate level you're like better or anything, but that is often seen as like the top tier of conducting or orchestral conducting, professional orchestras. It still is such a male dominated world when, if you look at spaces underneath that, the male female is pretty even as far as people going into the field. So I find that really interesting. I think 40 years ago, there was a lot less women going into choral music as there is now, right? There's more, it's more even at like the undergraduate level, but yet we look at the trends at the highest level and it's not matching in the leadership roles. So I'm curious as to like where that discord is happening. And, you talked about, there was an article, the University of Melbourne did a study in 2023, because you were talking about the artistic roles, that there are more girls in choir than boys, but yet more boys in male leadership roles. It's the same across the board in all realms of performing arts. So ballet is another example where a majority of the dancers are female, yet over 80% of the leadership roles in ballet is run by men, so choreography and directing, which is just so interesting because, again, most of the dancers are female. Obviously, in the orchestral world, it's still very much male dominated. There was that article in 2023 looked at the top 11 opera companies across the United States, and top being like biggest budgets, right? They looked at 16 seasons, and there was over 1,600 conductor positions, and only 86 were held by women, 5%.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so, I mean, in that regard, choral music is actually ahead of the curve because our numbers are better. But I think that, and then you look at who's in an opera, right? The artistic singers, there's probably more females than male, but then in those leadership roles, it's just completely male dominated. And then it's also male dominated outside.
And they're begging men to come too.
Yeah. Yes.
The opera houses are begging men.
It was really interesting too. In that same article, they looked at leadership roles outside of conducting, because of course the conductor is the most public part, but set designer, director, all the costumes, over 80% were men still outside of those, the conducting role. So I think that this is a performing arts issue, but I don't, I don't have the solution. I wish I did. I just think talking about it more makes people more aware of it and more aware of the way that they act, the way that they treat other people, making themselves more aware of, I think, just treating everyone equally, meaning that the way that you talk to a woman about her professionalism should be the same way you talk to a man. And if you weren't going to tell a man that he looked handsome in his suit, even if you want to hear it, Chris, don't tell a woman that she looks beautiful in her dress or whatever. I think that's the main point I'd like to make today, and to just be talking about these things, because I think the more that we talk about them, the less they're going to be occurring.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's well said. Nikki, thank you so much for spending an hour with me. This has been really fun to catch up, but also to shed some light on this important topic.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end of a conversation. If you are still hearing my voice, that means you're one of the MVPs, one of the diehards, one of the real ones, as the kids say. So if you are willing on the way out to check out a few different ways that you can help me continue to make this show high quality. One, use the promo code. That's the biggest one. At Sight Reading Factory, at mymusicfolders.com, at mychoirropes.com, at graphitepublishing.com, and endeavormusicpublishing.com. All of those take the Choralosophy checkout code. And of course, now the newest one is 3-Minute Theory. You can get a 15% discount when you enter Choralosophy at checkout there. And of course, going to Apple Podcasts and leaving a positive review is very helpful there, and sharing the episodes to your colleagues in real life and on social media. All of those things are incredibly helpful and allow me to continue to create this resource for you. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time.